So we're now going to look at adding images to a website, and we're going to do a couple of cool things. We're going to style up an image just so it looks a little bit modern, and then we're going to also talk about the impact of images on page load, both with the ability for the page to actually render the image, and second of all for your browser to actually download the image. And I mentioned earlier on in the series that typically 80% of a website being downloaded will be images. So it's really important to optimize your images for the web. But let's take a look first of all at just putting an image on the page as it is, basically. So let's do that now. Okay, so inside of our Finder, I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this IMG. Typically you'd find images stored in a folder called IMG. We've already got our CSS directory. Inside IMG, I've already got an item on the clipboard, which is basically a picture of a cat. So I'm just going to call this cat. So that now exists in there. It basically just looks like this. So this is an image that has the proportions, the ratio is equal. So we've got, I don't know, it's the pixel's width is the same as the pixel's height. So what we're going to do is in here we're going to create an image element. Now this is what we call a void element. So it basically doesn't self-close. It does self-close rather. And that's because we don't have content going within this element. It's purely an element that serves to pull in a resource from somewhere. So the attributes that we typically give an image element are the source. This is the most important. It's basically where the image comes from. And then we have the alt text, which is basically the text that's shown either to a user who's visually impaired and is using a screen reader to look down the page, and this will basically read out as the screen reader looks down the page. It will find an image and it will say this is an image of a cat. If we say this is an image of a cat, you don't need an alt. You can leave this empty if you don't want it read out. It just depends on how important the image is to the content that it relates to. So if it's relevant to be actually read out. And obviously this also helps users who are not visually impaired and could see the image properly. They would just see the text instead. So for example, like that. So I've not included a source to the image, but it's still saying this is an image of a cat. So at least the user has some idea of what should be there in place of it. But let's give the relative path. So we're going to say img/cat, and I can't remember what the extension was. It's a PNG image. So this image has been saved within my image editor as an optimized image. So if you use Photoshop, you'll have an option when you save it as save for web or export for web. I can't remember what it quite is. Basically, you want to try and get the image as lower file size as you possibly can without reducing the image quality. I mean, if the image quality isn't that important to you, you can reduce it to the point that the image quality does suffer slightly. But you want to take note that every time an image is loaded, this is more that the user's browser has to download. So when I hit refresh now, obviously the image can be found. So the alt text isn't shown to us, but it's still available to screen readers, people that are visually impaired and can't physically see the screen. But we've now got our image of our cat. So we've got our image in there. That is basically how we load an image onto the page. So let's quickly just do an inspect element here and just go over to the network tab and hit refresh, and we'll see what's pulled in. You can see this is making an additional HTTP request to our server, or in this case we're just viewing it within our browser from our files. But it's making an additional HTTP request to our server to go ahead and actually pull that in. So really you need to be really careful of how you're actually pulling images in. And this particularly relates to things like icons. Now, we'll be looking at font icons later, which is probably the best way to go about including little icons into your site. But if, for example, you just had an image of a back arrow, an image of a forward arrow, an image of a little home, an image of a little newsletter or something like that, and you included all of these images in your page, that's going to be like an additional 5 HTTP requests. It's really going to slow down. First of all, your server's going to have to serve more content. And second of all, your browser, your users are going to suffer, particularly those with lower bandwidth. So be careful when you're including images, but we will be looking at font icons later, which is a really good way of serving icons without using lots of images. You can also use sprite sheets as well, which we're not going to be covering in this series. So we've now included this cat image. How do we style this up? Well, let's say we want, let's say we have on websites now there's a trend where you have a circular image of a person. So rather than just having a square image, we'd have a circle. So we can add a class to this element. It doesn't matter, by the way, which order these attributes are in. But I'm going to have a class of circle image, for example. So now in my main style sheet, I can say, well, I want the circle image to be a circle. Well, how am I going to turn this image into a circle? Well, an image acts as if it were just a normal element, really. It acts as just whatever element it would. Let's look at some of the computed styles. So we've got a display of inline, and we've got a height here, which is basically the height or the natural height of the image, 190 by 190. But what we can do here is we can give a border radius, much like we did when we styled the button earlier on in the series. So we can give a border radius. So I could say 10 pixels, for example. And all that will do is just round off the borders of the image. So it already looks a little bit nicer. It's less harsh on the eyes. However, if I want this to be a circle, I've got a couple of options. I can say, well, I want this to be 1,000 or 10,000 border radius. That's going to turn it into a circle, basically. But I wouldn't recommend this as good practice because it's a little bit annoying. What happens if you do have an image of 10,000 pixels? You probably wouldn't, but that's not the point. Even if you did 200 pixels, that would still render it as a circle. But if that image grew any larger than 200 pixels, you wouldn't get the full circle effect. So instead we do 50%. We use percentages. Percentages are always going to be relative to how big the actual image is, and therefore we get the same result, but however big this image gets, it's going to stay the same. So that's a little cool way that we can actually style that image, and you can do pretty much everything you would normally do with an image, but with styles. So you could add a border here. So we could say 3 pixels solid and black, and you've probably already guessed that will go round the circle as well. So it will look exactly the same. So for example, we could do a border, we could do a box shadow, which we haven't actually looked at yet. We've looked at text shadow, but box shadow pretty much has the same properties. We have an X and Y offset, we have a blur, and then we have the color value. So in this case, I'm going to do black and 0.2. We've already seen this. And there we go. If we just harsh that a little bit. There we go. We've got a little shadow there. In fact, let's do a little bit more of a spread and set these out a little bit more. There we go. So you can see that we've got the shadow there. So you can play around with images pretty much as you would a div element. The only difference is that these are inline. So if I was to type hello cat there, you can see that sits inline to this element. So it sits inline, and then the image is sort of, there, and the text sits at the bottom of that. So if you did want this with text above it and below it, I wouldn't necessarily recommend setting an image to a block level, because as soon as we do that, it really just, it's silly. What if this was an anchor or something like that? It would just stretch things out a little bit. So for example, if we did an anchor here, and the image was inside the anchor, I guess this is another little tip, like so, and that went somewhere. Because that's a block level element now, we saw this example earlier, the clickable area has been extended to the full width of its parent container, which is really, really annoying. So what I'd recommend doing is, rather than setting a display of block, you would do something like hello cat. Now that's still going to sit in line because we've got an anchor there, but what you could do is you could either have that like so in a paragraph tag, which, because a paragraph is a block level element, that's going to automatically push that underneath it. Or you could probably do something like div class equals image container, and you don't necessarily have to give that any styles, but you might have a generic image container that you use, and that would then give you pretty much the same effect. But there's ways you can play around with these. You understand now, hopefully, about displays, you understand about floats and things like that, so you can play around with it and do what you want in terms of that. But that's basically how we pull images in. Bear in mind the page performance, and I guess we forgot to talk about the page rendering as well. So let's strip this back to its most basic example. So let's get rid of all of that. Oops, let's get rid of that. Pull that inwards. And in here, let's, we'll keep it as it is, I guess. So as it stands, this image is 190 pixels in its natural width. We know that. The computed styles here are at 190 and 190. Now what we want to do to speed up page rendering time, i.e. how fast it takes for this to be rendered, I spoke at the start of the series about the browser renders everything, the server doesn't do anything. Your markup really is just sent after a request to the server, to the user, and then the user has whatever browser they're using, it's rendered. But the width of the element has to be computed unless we specifically define it, which is a lot more useful to the browser. This will speed up the page rendering time. So if you know that you're going to have an image that's going to have a width, and a specific width and a height, by doing that, you're already removing the need for this to be actually computed, and therefore it's speeding things up a little bit more. You'll notice that if we actually remove them over in the computed section here, these little arrows will go, because it knows that once you add the width and the height here, that they're coming from circle image at 190, and that's why these are computed at that size. That it doesn't have to do any work to work out the actual size of the image. Now, if this was a responsive website and you wanted the image to be sort of responsive, you've got a little bit of a problem, because if, for example, the width of the image was, I'm just going to make this 290, like so, and you pull that inwards, it's going to be a little bit difficult. In actual fact, let's make it a little bit bigger because the browser is not letting me go any smaller, like so. So I can make it even bigger actually, say 590, like so. So say I want this to be a width of 590, but then when the browser gets small enough, I want this to come inwards. Well, this is no good. It was like when we did our container example earlier, it didn't work very well because it's fixed at that point. So it means that when the browser is smaller, we have to go over and back like that. So we're going to set a max width to 590, max height to 590, and here we can set the width to 100% if we wanted to. If the actual image was 590 to start with, you wouldn't have to do this width because its natural width is 590. So now what's happening is it's a 590, but as we pull this in, it scales to that particular size. And this works exactly the same as if you're in a container as well, some kind of generic container for your page. Or if you have, for example, in the last example when we looked at floating, if you had images within each 3 of them containers and they pulled in, you could also have them at 100% width as well, and they would scale inwards as the browser got smaller. So that's a little introduction to images and a couple of things to consider. Next, we're going to look at validating HTML and CSS using the W3C validator.